So, as I mentioned in the last lecture, after the collapse of centralized Gupta authority, northern India becomes a politically fractured place. And the map on the left gives you a sense of the polities in India by about 700 AD. As you can see, there are a great many of them: north, south, central, east, west, and so forth. Um, for our purposes, this final unit of study here pertaining to India is really going to focus upon the arrival of Islam and Muslims into the subcontinent, for they have had a very important impact upon Indian history, to say the least. And thus, we might say, the most important development of the post-Gupta period, leading up to about 750 AD, occurred in far western India in a place called Sindh. Sindh. And so you can see it on the map on the left there. There it is, roughly today, southern and central Pakistan. And you can see a close-up of this area, the map on the right. This is the first part of India where Muslims will acquire a true foothold. And the story goes something like this. An invasion force was sent in 711 to this part of India. The Sindh coast was known decades earlier due to trade networks and the economic connections between the Caliphate and India, which flowed through the Persian Gulf and flowed through the Red Sea. And what led to the invasion of this part of India was an incident of piracy off the coast involving Muslims. And the local Indian ruler received complaints from the Caliph in Baghdad. Pardon me, the Caliph in Damascus, but the governor, the Arab governor of Baghdad, but did not take it very seriously. And as a result, this governor and some of his military advisors decided to send basically an armada to this part of India. And they were quite successful. They made their way up the Indus River Valley, conquering, as you can see on these maps, a good deal of this part of India, and then installed themselves there in a permanent way. And this marked a major change in the course of Indian history because, again, this is the first territorial foothold that Muslims have in India. Other contact with Islam came through basically trading outposts in Bengal, in Kerala, in Sri Lanka, and so forth. Again, attached to the caravan trade routes that went up through the Persian Gulf, up through the Red Sea, up Western Arabia, and so forth that we talked about in the last unit of study. In the longer term, if you take a look at these maps, and then this map, modern map of India and Pakistan, you can see why this is important. If you are unaware, the Indian subcontinent was partitioned once it became independent in 1947 into two states, India and Pakistan, and that partition was undertaken along religious lines. The majority Muslim areas of the subcontinent were turned into Pakistan, seen here on the map. Bangladesh, which you see on the map, was once a part of Pakistan, but in the 70s, a rather brutal civil war erupted, and Bangladesh became its own state in that context. But as you can see, Sindh is southern and central Pakistan. And so this development in Indian history, again, has long-term ramifications. It is the beginning of the Islamicization of this part of the subcontinent. The process through which this part of the subcontinent is made majority Islam, majority Muslim. And the reading assignment that you will undertake after this lecture will take you into this very interesting and unique part of Pakistan where religious syncretism does its best to flourish today in the very difficult circumstances of the Pakistani cultural, religious, and political scene. So, all right, there you have it. All right, another important development. We get some Chinese travelers wandering about India at this time. They are Chinese Buddhists. We're going to talk about that directly in our next unit of study. This guy here, you see a nice image of him on the right. Obviously, he's a traveler. He has a big bag and a nice little umbrella there to keep himself in the shade. He wandered throughout India, predominantly northern India, for about 15 years. And again, he was a Buddhist. He came from China, and he was curious about Buddhism in its homeland, right? And he recorded everything he saw, recorded notes about the monks with whom he interacted, and said something of the Buddhist infrastructure of the place. And what he generally recorded was a sort of healthy Buddhism in the north of the country. But beyond that, he provides evidence for our first indication of Buddhist decline in India in certain other places of India, especially in central and southern India, where Hinduism was emerging in a very vigorous manner. And one of the interesting elements of Indian history is that India gave birth to Buddhism, right? It is the place in the world where it first took root and spread substantially and widely. And yet today, there are very few Buddhists in India. It was eventually wiped out. It eventually became extinct in its own homeland, or nearly extinct in its own homeland. And as you may be aware, today Buddhism is practiced predominantly in Asia, East Asia, by hundreds of millions of people. We will turn to that again in our next unit of study when we study China. But here in the 7th century, we really get our first glimpse that everything's not right with Buddhism in India. It's our first glimpse of this. All right. So, our final period of study for India will be from about 1000 to about 1200 AD, a glimpse at an important period in medieval Indian history. And this is important for, in a sense, one central reason: the establishment of a centralized Muslim state across the whole of northern India, what we call the Delhi Sultanate. How does this happen? Well, that is a complex story, but it involves Turkish slave soldiers serving in the military of the Islamic Caliphate in the Middle East. Over time, in the Caliphate, it became practice to recruit, or rather to buy, younger Turkish men in Central Asian slave markets and raise them effectively as soldiers. They obviously became very good soldiers because that's all they knew. They were trained to do this professionally. The problem for the caliphs and the civilian infrastructure of the caliphate is that eventually these slave soldiers realized that they didn't necessarily need their civilian overlords. And eventually they do, in fact, take matters into their own hands and simply overthrow them various places throughout the caliphate. This process played out in northeast Iran, Afghanistan, various areas in what is modern-day Turkey, and so forth. In any case, the details are not too important, but eventually one of these individuals, decides to take a new direction. His name is Muhammad of Ghur, which refers to a region in what is today central Afghanistan. He decided he would invade northern India with the specific intent to conquer territory. Muslim armies had been raiding into northern India for some time, for nearly 200 years by this point. But these were raids. They'd come, plunder, leave. And so it wasn't a permanent thing. Muhammad of Ghur changed the dynamic because he had a plan to create a permanent state across northern India. And indeed, eventually, he was successful. And he did eventually conquer the majority of the Ganges River basin, extending all the way to Bengal. And this represented a tremendously new dynamic for India. This represented a very, very new Muslim presence in northern India. The end result of this is the creation of what's called the Delhi Sultanate, which was established in 1206 by this man here, Qutb ud-Din Aibak, who was a slave general who had served under Muhammad of Ghur. This ushered in roughly 600 years of Muslim influence and supremacy over northern India. The Delhi Sultanate was in fact succeeded in the 16th century by the Mughal dynasty. So a major, major development in Indian history. You cannot understand or explain modern India as it exists today without understanding the Muslim impact, the Islamic influence, and it begins here with Muhammad of Ghur, Qutb ud-Din Aibak, and the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate. This changes so much, right? This begins the process of the blending of Indian and Islamic civilization in manifold ways. A rather enormous topic. But some results include the blossoming of Sikhism, the rejuvenation of the Sufi schools of Central Asia, and their incorporation into the Indian fold. And you will meet the Sufis in the Red Fairy reading. And tremendous influences over the language of northern India, the blending of Arabo-Persian and Turkish and Hindi. Again, a very complex subject, but what you fundamentally have here is the beginning of the blending of Indian and Islamic civilization in a large, meaningful, long-term way. And you can see the geographical extent here on the map of the Delhi Sultanate. Right? At its high point, it incorporated nearly the whole of the subcontinent. But for the most part, its core was confined to the northern half of India. But this is a big change, a very different sort of Muslim presence in India. These rulers of the Delhi Sultanate would also successfully defend India against the Mongols, the single ruling dynasty anywhere in Eurasia which met with that type of success. So an important, very important development in Indian history. And this is why we conclude with this period in Indian history. Okay, we are going to conclude with just a few comments on developments in the religious sphere during this period. First, Hinduism. This period witnessed the final and most important maturation of Hinduism. And so this period is the point in Indian history when it seems, generally speaking, historians will agree, okay, now you have a fully recognizable Hinduism on the subcontinent. Now, we have so far already discussed two of the key components of Hinduism: Vedic Brahmanism, centered on the Brahmin priests themselves, the supremacy of the Vedas, various sacrifices to the Vedic gods, the caste system, and the role of performing one's duties within one's caste, and its relationship to samsara, reincarnation. And we've looked at a second key component, devotional worship, bhakti, centered on the great theistic traditions of Vaishnavism and Shivism. Now to this we shall add a third, the local cults, which have given so much to the richness of Hinduism. What can we say of these local cults? Well, at this point in Indian history, even at this late date, beginning in 1000 AD, there were still many on the subcontinent who followed what we would call inchoate beliefs that existed exclusively at the village or intensely local level, had done so for centuries. This often involved goddess worship, animal sacrifice, and animism. But the Puranic end of emerging Hinduism proved capable of absorbing these practices and deities into the flexible, malleable pantheon of emerging Hinduism, into Hinduism's religiously syncretistic umbrella, a great strength for any religion. And so, these tremendously diverse, and we cannot even begin to summarize them here, local cults at this time were finally incorporated into the broader emerging umbrella of Hinduism. And so we can say that these three components finally come together at this time. The Vedic Brahmanistic foundations, the devotional worship centered on bhakti and the theistic traditions, Vaishnavism and Shivism especially, and now the local cults, right, that are sort of providing the furniture, the interior of the house of Hinduism. If the Vedic Brahmanism is the foundations and the bhakti is the walls and the roof, the local cults are filling it all out, right? They're the interior. Some of the more powerful cults locally were centered on Devi or Shakti, those that worship the mother goddess and her power for doing all good or evil in the world. In the Hindu pantheon, these would become Uma and Parvati, representing respectively the beneficial side of the mother goddess. Major components of Hinduism today. The overall effects of the incorporation of the local cults will be to lead to a significant increase in image worship, the worship of idols, and the full and totalistic incorporation of the tremendously complex and wonderful mythological narratives that breathe so much life into Hinduism today and are such a key component of any polytheistic religious system. These mythological narratives came to be expanded upon, expounded, and popularized throughout India's numerous regional languages and in oral forms. So big and important developments in the sphere of Hinduism during this time too. What we might call positive developments. Hinduism is on the rise. Buddhism, however, is declining. And it is in fact this period of history which seems to witness the final and rather steep decline of Buddhism throughout India. Why? Why? This is a question historians have asked. It's a big question, it's a complex question. There's no ready answer for it. But certainly shifting political winds have something to do with it. From the Gupta period onward, the political class of India is more and more Hindu in orientation and directing more and more resources toward emerging Hinduism. And Buddhists are more and more left out of patronage networks. That is to say, royal patronage declined. Not universally, but it did. And that would have had an effect. So too, we can point to very localized examples of persecutions of Buddhists from the Gupta period onward at this time. That is to say, we can see in the post-Gupta period leading up to this period the emergence of what we might call fundamentalist Hindu monarchs, a new element in Indian history. Though generally historians tend to think that a policy of pluralism was maintained. That is to say, violence and persecution were the exception, not the norm. But in the bigger picture, if we're asking, well, why Hinduism in India and not Buddhism? I think we can locate that answer in the tremendously flexible, inclusive nature of this dynamic, polytheistic faith. We can locate the answer in bhakti, the ability for the masses and individuals to worship in a highly personalized, individualized way. And we can locate our answer in the tremendous degree to which Hinduism offered a means to live in a prosperous, happy manner within one's caste, encouraging marriage, encouraging child rearing, encouraging the enjoyment of life, sexual relations, prosperity, and so forth. All of this was obviously more appealing in, let's say, the marketplace of religions, which existed in India during this period. And so we end up with a map of India in 1909 that looks like this, dominated by Hindus. Buddhists almost nowhere to be found. For again, Buddhism was nearly exterminated, nearly became extinct in its place of origin. Not totally. There are still Buddhists in India today, but they are a very, very small minority. Hinduism is the dominant faith, the majority religion, and the second largest beyond that is Islam. We will talk in the next unit of study about the fate of Buddhism in East Asia, where it came to prevail and was very successful. If you have any questions about this lecture, do get in touch.